Okay, hello everybody. This is Karol Boudreaux joining you today for the first Google Hangout for MOOC 2.0. We're delighted to have you joining us today wherever in the world you are. We're in just outside of Washington, D.C. in Maryland, but look forward to talking to people from many places. So this is our first interactive session with you. You can think of it maybe as a chance to come see the teacher during office hours. It gives us an opportunity to explore together issues that are of interest to you, that are related to or raised in the first set of modules, which are the 3 core modules. So remember that in our first 3 core modules, and if you haven't taken all 3, it's okay. You can participate in this Hangout and take the modules after this Hangout. For those of you who join us later, this is going to be recorded, and so you can review the Hangout. But remember, in these first 3 modules, what we're trying to do is really give you a very strong, a very solid foundation. Hold on just one second. Okay, we're trying to deal with a camera issue. So it says, okay, good. So problem solved. Sorry about that for a few moments. I'm glad I'm here with you again. So what we were saying is our focus for these first 3 modules is to provide you with a really good, solid foundation in the issues related to land tenure and property rights. So what we do is introduce you in module number 1 to some of the key theories and some of the key ideas that motivate work that's being done in the land sector. And then in module 2, very generally speaking, what we try to do is introduce you to some of the unique language that we use in the land sector. So it seems a little bit more familiar to you because in subsequent modules, other presenters use the same kind of language, and we want you to be familiar with it so you feel like you're a part of this group of people working around the world on these issues. And then in our 3rd module, which is presented by Dr. Cheryl Das, we also introduce you to some of the important questions related to gender and land tenure. Gender is a cross-cutting theme. That's the way we think about it. And so important in all the areas that we address in the land sector to consider how activities or programs or approaches are going to affect and impact not only men and boys, but women and girls as well, and how we can bring those groups together to improve outcomes for all groups. Okay, so I'm very quickly going to talk a little bit about what we covered in these 3 modules, but then I'm going to really dive into your questions. And I wanted to remind everybody that you can send us questions. We've had a couple of questions submitted already, but please feel free to send us additional questions so that we can talk about what's of interest to you. Maybe I'm going to stop for just a second and say, as a moderator of the discussion forum, I have been so impressed by the level of discussion that I've seen in the discussion forum to date. So folks are asking really interesting, sophisticated questions in the discussion forum. It's a pleasure for me as a moderator to be able to engage with those questions. And so please keep your questions coming. Dr. Karen and I are both really enjoying the discussion. In these first core modules, we covered the following kinds of questions. In module 1, we were talking about how it is and why it is that property rights or land tenure systems evolve and why this is important. And this is a question I'm going to come back to because I think this evolutionary point comes up again and again in the discussion threads, and it's really a critically important point. So right now, I'm just going to highlight that raises this question. It introduces you to the idea that land tenure systems are not static systems, typically. They're evolving systems, and it is important that they continue to evolve. So then secondly, we talk in Module 1 about why land tenure and property rights issues are important for development outcomes. So how are they related to outcomes such as food security? How are they related to issues related to environmental protection or conservation, biodiversity? How are they related to women's empowerment, etc.? And there are many linkages. The point of Module 1, in part, is to show you there are many linkages between the idea that people have secure rights over land and other assets, other property, and good development outcomes. We also talk about some of the problems that are typical and that we face in the land sector. And again, in the discussion thread, I've seen many of you raise concerns around the amount of resources, financial resources, or human capital resources that you have in your country. And limited financial or human capital resources can make it very challenging to address some land tenure issues, but not all. And so I hope one of the important takeaways is that when you're thinking about land tenure issues, you don't always need to think about great, big, giant, expensive programs in order to make progress. Sometimes you can develop and implement activities or projects that look to make change, as an economist might say, on the margin. Marginal incremental change over time can add up to important developments, can add up to important improvements for people on the ground. You don't always need to rely on very high-tech solutions either. Even as the cost of technologies or some technologies comes down, it is still the case that some low-tech approaches can be extremely successful and extremely useful and practical to help secure rights to people on the ground. So these are some of the challenges that we talk about, but there are other challenges as well, and those might be related to questions like corruption or political will, or just the challenges around raising awareness to land tenure issues. So then we end Module 1 with a discussion of what are some of the solutions we could look to. And here again, I think we try to point out that incremental change can be a very practical approach to improving the land tenure situation, but also importantly, we try to emphasize that what might be a good approach is to develop secure, to aim for secure enough land tenure rights. So what I mean by secure enough is what is appropriate in your context, in your location, given the stakeholders you're working with, to secure their rights over land. It may not be that you need to issue individualized titles to parcels of land. It may be what would get you secure enough is to identify or demarcate or delimit the boundaries of community or customary lands and recognize that delimitation, make sure it's done in a technically capable way so that people understand where those boundaries and borders are and agree about those. That might be secure enough for a particular community. Okay, I'm going to stop for just a second. Then in Module 2, that's our terms and concepts module. And so we talk about these terms that maybe some of you have heard before, but some of these terms may be new. We talk about land tenure and we talk about land governance, a broader set of ideas than land tenure. But really land governance, the idea that the idea that the institutions plus the rules plus the processes associated with identifying, allocating, transferring, using land, other natural assets and resources. This system should be relatively transparent. It should be accountable to the people who are part of the system. It should lead to, in general, good outcomes for people on the ground. So land governance, just like governance at a higher level, land governance should be serving the people who are part of the system, helping them to achieve the goals that are important to them broadly, working in an equitable and fair manner to help achieve good outcomes on the ground. So that would be land governance. We talk lot of reasons. A number of you have raised questions around autonomy, for example, and the importance of being able to make decisions around how assets and land get used and at what level do those decisions get made. Tenure security allows the person who has that security to make decisions about how assets get used. Usually doesn't give them absolute freedom to make any decisions, but it gives them scope to make decisions about how assets can and should be used, who can come in to the land or not, how you withdraw the value from the land, and whether or not you can transfer it. And so that is related to the question of a bundle of rights. And a bundle of rights in land is a concept that's very familiar to lawyers and to economists especially. It says that with regard to an asset, you might have different rights to use, withdraw from, transfer, leverage, mortgage, property. Rights might be considered a stick, like I'm holding my pen, stick in a bundle. If I had lots of pins, my bundle would be very thick. And so lawyers would say if you have many different kinds of rights to land, you can, as the right holder, give one of your rights away to somebody else. And having that opportunity to make decisions and trade the sticks in your bundle of property rights can make your property rights more valuable. We talked a little bit about land administration and what land administration systems look like and what they consist of. And I just want to alert you to the fact that there is a whole separate module on land administration. And so if you're someone interested in land administration and cadasters, for example, we have a question that's come in this morning for me, from Solomon in Ethiopia about the urban legal cadaster. Solomon, you should definitely watch the land administration module. I think you'll find it really interesting. But suffice to say that land administration is typically the state-led process of recognizing, recording, and managing transfers related to land and assets. And it's an important system. It's usually doesn't have to be complicated, but usually a system that gathers a lot of information together and puts it in a central location. Maybe sometimes cadasters are decentralized or registries are decentralized, but it brings the information about land, geospatial information, tax information, demographic information together in one place. And that can be really valuable to have that place to go to understand if the system's kept up. Who owns what? Where are they? Are there any encumbrances on the property? Okay, so we finish with module 2 by talking about land formalization and why that's important. I'll just say really quickly, land formalization is the process, typically we think of it as the process of taking customary lands that may not be documented, and providing some form of legal recognition to those lands. It could be through a certificate of use, could be through maybe a title document, but it provides some additional recognition that the property is held by a person or a group under particular conditions. And so it creates that evidence and that information trail that can be useful to sort of sort out what the on-the-ground reality related to land is. Okay, I'm going to take another deep breath. In module 3, which is the final core module for the introductory sessions, Dr. Das talked about gender and land tenure. And we looked at a couple of different issues kind of broadly. Number one, I think really interesting, Dr. Das's talk relies a lot on data and research she's done with colleagues. And she talks about how women own or hold land in different parts of the world. And what does ownership mean in these different contexts, and what does it mean for women and for men? And so if you haven't watched module 3 yet, please do take the time to watch it, because it's just fascinating to see how women themselves might perceive themselves to be owners, but when you press a little bit and ask, are there names on documents? In many cases, that's not the case. She spends time talking about the different kinds of decision-making authority that women often have in households as compared to men in households. She talks about how women acquire rights to land, and it's oftentimes through inheritance as opposed to through market transactions. And so this raises an important question for us in the land sector about how inheritance systems, whether those are customary systems or statutory systems, how are those systems set up, and do they work in a fairly equitable manner to ensure that wives and daughters, also nieces, also have access to and are able to inherit lands? If not, are there actions or activities that could be taken, reforms, legislative or regulatory reforms that could be taken to provide some greater equality between the inheritance options of girls and the inheritance options of boys, girls and women, boys and men? But in addition, it also points to the fact that custom, an issue we come back to over and over again in this course, no matter what the formal legal system says, custom still has an important role to play in how women and girls do inherit property as compared to men and boys. So Dr. Doss also talks about why is it important to secure women and girls' rights to land? Why is this an issue we should care about? And points to some of the growing body of empirical evidence that suggests that when you provide secure rights to women and girls, what you will see are improvements, increased spending, improvements at the household level, increased spending on, say, children's nutrition, increased spending on children's education, and so some what you might think of as positive spillover benefits within the household that will have future ramifications, right? This is so important. By securing these rights for women and girls, women make different choices within the household about how to spend money that's earned from land. Those different choices tend to mean that women invest in their households, in their family members. And so in the future, what we might expect to see is that women who have more secure rights over land also have children who are healthier. They also have children who are better educated. Maybe those children make different contributions to the broader economy in future years. So some of the reasons why women's land rights are important. And then she concludes with, okay, if this is important, how do we actually work to make that happen, to secure more women's rights? Okay, and this is an important issue for those of you who work on gender equality concerns, and she points to a couple very practical steps that can be taken to secure women's land rights. And so one of the first most important steps is, if you're involved in a land formalization process, if you're a government official, for example, who's involved in a land titling exercise, make sure that there's room on your documentation for a wife's name as well as a husband's name. Of course, in some situations, you may need to have more than one line for wives' names, but at least make space for enumerators to capture information about not only the male head of household, but his spouse. Also consider the fact that women are oftentimes heads of households themselves, and recognize women as heads of households. If your legal system doesn't allow for that, or regulations don't allow for you to capture women as a head of household, consider amending your legal or regulatory framework to ensure that women can be recognized as heads of households. This may be especially, it's important in any one of these situations, but it's really important in resettlement activities too, that you recognize that women can be heads of households, because resettlement benefits are typically tied to being recognized as a head of household. So those are a few steps that can be taken to address this question of securing women's rights to land. Of course, raising awareness is also critically important, as it is across all the work that we do. Raising a legal awareness of rights that exist, usually under the statutory law. In the case of women's rights, women also hold international law rights to property. So raising awareness of legal rights is another important strategy you can adopt. Maybe also, though, just as important as raising awareness is engaging actively and respectfully with men and boys, and talking with them about the benefits that can flow to them, their families, and their communities when women and girls' rights to land, their inheritance rights, their rights to marital property, when those rights are respected, when they're accorded to women, and when they're not denied to women. So that's a really quick walkthrough of what we covered in modules 1, 2, and 3. Again, I want to encourage you, if you haven't completed all 3 modules, please take the time and complete those, because once you complete those 3, of course, that opens up the rest of the MOOC to you. And the MOOC is just a very rich source of information. And so we want to really encourage you to move through the core modules so you can get to that other specialized knowledge that's contained in the other and the remaining modules. Okay, so with that sort of quick background and update, I'm going to turn to some of the questions that we've gotten. And again, if you have questions, please feel free to continue chatting them to us. So I have a question that's come in from Solomon. Thank you so much, Solomon, in Ethiopia. And Solomon's question is related to the urban legal cadastre that's being developed in Ethiopia. Ethiopia, such an interesting and a complex society. Solomon's question is really, I think if I understand it correctly, really around sustainability. Okay, the government is investing to develop this new urban legal cadastre. I talked a moment about the importance of having these kinds of systems because it brings information together, it makes it easy, again, economicsy kind of talk. It reduces search costs for people. You bring all the information together in one place, makes it easier for people to search about what is. So Ethiopia is undertaking this effort to develop an urban legal cadastre. The point is not only to gather information in a central location, but also to help promote tenure security for folks living in urban areas. So the question is, how can a system like that be sustainable? Because you do need revenues. You do need some kind of revenue stream to support the activities associated with running a cadastre. It's one thing to set a cadastre up. The cadastre isn't going to be very good if it's not maintained, and maintaining the system takes resources, human capital resources, as well as financial resources. So Solomon tells us that at first the government is going to support and fund some of the efforts to register rights, and so local people may not have to pay to register their rights at first. Those costs might be subsidized. But how can you identify a way to promote financial sustainability for a system like this? So this is an interesting question, and there are probably innumerable ways this could happen. If those of you who are on the chat or on the Hangout have other ideas, please share your other ideas. This could be done by, well, for example, charging a fee for the services. So if you have a subsequent transfer of your property, let's say you sell your rights to somebody else, your rights to use property to somebody else, or let's say that you transfer property to a family member, when you record transfer, it would be typical for the cadastre to charge you a fee to make those to record those services. So that might not be enough to cover all costs, and importantly, it may quickly become a barrier. So if a cadastre is charging fees that are not really comfortable for the local population, people may very rapidly revert to informal transfers, and so then the cadastre would not be able to support itself by charging fees. So maybe other options would be things like a dedicated line of funding coming from the federal government, dedicated stream of resources that would come into the cadastre on an annual basis that would be devoted specifically to maintaining the resource itself. So having a dedicated stream of funding gives the cadastre office a little breathing room, a little better ability to plan for future activities. And this could be one way to address the question that Solomon is raising. So from the government side, charging fees, creating a dedicated funding stream could be options. And as I said a moment ago, I'm sure there are many other options, and I hope the cadastre folks who have joined us will speak up. Okay, then, so thank you very much for that question, Solomon. And then we had another question that came in from Nigeria. Good question around land fragmentation. So in Nigeria, as a result of a growing population, for other reasons, land is increasingly fragmented. This would be the same sort of situation, say, in Rwanda, where there's a relatively high population, much smaller country, and land is increasingly fragmented, so people hold very small parcels of land. So how could you abate land fragmentation is really the question, because fragmented land holdings can make it difficult, for example, to take advantage of economies of scale. It can be hard to create larger sized farms, maybe if you're in rural areas, if land is fragmented, and if systems to trade land or borrow land are not functioning effectively. So a couple of I'll offer two ideas on how could you abate land fragmentation. The first idea I'd like to offer is looking carefully at the leasehold laws and regulations around land. So if the leasehold laws and regulations are cumbersome and make it difficult for people to trade in or trade out land, this could mean that you can't take your fragmented land and engage in a beneficial transaction with your neighbor to lease it to the neighbor who might be able to use it more productively. So arrangements, legal arrangements around leasehold actually are extraordinarily important. And I would suggest take a look at that first to see if there are any barriers that system raises to leasing in and leasing out land, because land fragmentation can be overcome if people can voluntarily consolidate land. So leasing in and leasing out is a way to voluntarily consolidate parcels that are otherwise dispersed and fragmented. The second option would be to think about approaches like land banks, where people can list their land as being available for others to use. Lands can be, let's say a potential investor could be a domestic investor, local investor. An investor has an idea to use land for a particular purpose, could check in a land bank to see if there are parcels available in close proximity that she could use in order to pursue a particular investment. So in some countries, land banks work reasonably well and can help to address this question of land fragmentation. Some countries, and Rwanda is a country like this, have legal statutes, have statutory law related to land consolidation. Sometimes land consolidation will require or lead to the government compulsorily acquiring land in order to create larger parcels. I think compulsory land acquisition tied to land consolidation can be a much more challenging and fraught approach to dealing with this issue, because it does create opportunities for those people who have better access to information and those who have more resources maybe to benefit from these kinds of processes. So look to leaseholds and leasing in, leasing out, and trying to improve and facilitate leasing in and leasing out as an option, but also consider looking at land banks as another option. Okay, so now let me, now I'm gonna have to read some questions because they came in while I was talking. So here's another question. There are organizations setting up infrastructure in the energy sector, right? So this could be gas, oil, solar, hydro, etc. Is it a good idea to have operational land policy? If so, what aspects of tenure should a land policy for a land acquisition body, just talking about that, have or drafters consider? Thank you very much. This is a really important question. Yeah, especially as countries start developing, their economies grow, it's critical that countries have reliable, dependable access to energy for their citizens and for the businesses operating within their borders. And so whether that energy comes from solar, whether it comes from hydro, you can see immediately that there are land tenure implications for the development of those kinds of projects. Solar projects, wind farm projects take up a fair amount of land. And so how you identify the land that's going to be used for these projects, how you deal with the existing rights that people may have to that land, if you need to use a compulsory acquisition process to acquire that land, how you identify and compensate people who are going to almost necessarily be moved from the land, but who may still have a few use rights over that land. How you engage in that process will have tremendous, it's almost trite to say, tremendous impact on those people. So do you need an operational policy? My strong recommendation would be yes, that you have a clear safeguards policy designed to, number one, identify who currently lives in the area that will be affected by the compulsory acquisition. So you need to have a pretty broad stakeholder mapping of the folks who are in the area who will be impacted directly and perhaps also indirectly by the project. You do, especially if you're following, say, IFC performance standard or World Bank guidance, you need to create an inventory of the assets and the rights that those people have over that land. And so here, again, this is one of those places where the gender lens can be very helpful because, as Dr. Das notes, it's oftentimes the case that women hold different kinds of use rights to land and assets than do men. And so if you're going to pursue a compulsory acquisition, if you're going to need to move people, forcibly move people from an area, or encourage them to move through a voluntary process, you want to understand who's there, what are the assets that are there, and how people use them, so that when you come to the compensation phase, you're adequately compensating people for the losses that they're going to suffer. The people who live on the land that's going to be acquired bear direct costs for this development. Society at large is going to have dispersed benefits as a result of developing this project, but those people who bear direct costs should be adequately compensated. And the standard, as I'm sure the questioner knows, is they must be put in as good a position as they were before the acquisition or in a better position as a result of this acquisition. So having good, clear, strong operational policies is critically important to guide that process and to be sure that it's an equitable, a transparent, and a fair process. So yeah, thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for that question. That was great. Okay, so I'm going down to another question. This is coming out of, let's see, KwaZulu-Natal. Okay, and the land reform. So, the South African land reform process. What a long-standing and complicated process this is. And right now, so the South Africans, of course, are revisiting the question of land reform, and I see that there may be a 50-50 land sharing and ownership approach that's been proposed. So, yep, this is trying to address serious historical inequities. How the South African government navigates this process is, of course, the issue that's most critically important, and is it, again, done, I'll be redundant, but this is important, is this process done in a transparent manner and in a way that recognizes and, the compensation bit is just difficult in South Africa, but at least recognizes the constitutional rights South Africans have to holding private property. So wow, that's one of these times. The South Africa question is one of the great examples of something we say a lot in this sector. Land is emotive. It's very emotive. Land is identity, it's culture, it's tied to religious concerns for people, but boy, land is also political. And the South Africans are addressing some of the politics of land right now. I'm going to go on to Obi Chinedu's question, and again, I apologize, I have to read it, but let me just read it through. Developing a geographical indication for certification of origin-linked food can serve as a means of protecting culture, knowledge, income, and markets of goods. Examples like the Campaign for Wine have been used to illustrate how geographical identification can improve income and marketability of local products in sub-Saharan Africa. This concept is in the making. I think maybe meaning it's kind of a new idea. And only 3 such names have been protected. Oh, great question. Yeah, do you think that the land tenure system in an area can affect the successful development of geographical identifications? Yeah, that is a really interesting question. So I think one of the other geographical indications is coffee. I think Ethiopia may have a geographical identification for some of its really high quality coffee. And yes, you can certainly see that maybe Tanzania could do a similar kind of thing. There's all kinds, I mean, this is sort of a wide open area. If you can identify a product with a place, and that place is valued, what does that mean for land tenure issues? It means that the people who control that land have an increasingly valuable resource. And so this is a little bit like putting irrigation into areas that are served by rain-fed agriculture right now. Areas that have recognized geographical indications are areas where you're going to be able likely to make more money on the market by selling your product. And so it's especially important to identify who does have legitimate rights to that area. And if it's an area that's been under customary land tenure systems traditionally, then the question would be, are you able to secure the rights to that important geographical area and the geographical indication itself? Because that's a kind of property. Are you able to secure those rights in the community? You would want to work really hard to make sure that the legitimate land rights holders in those areas benefit from efforts to promote a geographical indication. So that's a really interesting question, and thank you so much for that. I do think there's a lot of potential in adopting that kind of an approach, not only for primary goods, I mean, especially cocoa, coffee, this is already happening, cocoa, coffee, but probably a much broader array of products, whether those are, say, village products in Southern Africa or medicinal products. So yeah, for me, I would always be thinking about how can the community also benefit from those kinds of activities. Okay, there's like a ton of questions. I'm looking at my time, so please, I may not get to all of these, but I'm gonna hope that I get to as many as possible. Okay, so I have a comment here. To deal with land fragmentation, the best solution is consolidation of land holdings. This is from Aswani. Thank you, Aswani in India, who says, here in India, different states have different land consolidation rules and regulations, but the objective of consolidation is to reduce the number of fragments. Yeah, exactly. Because there's not a whole lot you can do with tiny, tiny parcels of land. You can put land to more productive use if you bring parcels together. I think the question is, how do you facilitate that bringing together of parcels? Do you do it sort of by force? Are you going to rely on the government to do that, or do you want to rely on a more voluntary process to do that? And that's where those leasing in, leasing out markets would come into place. But yeah, the reason to consolidate holdings is to allow for more productive use of those holdings. So thank you, Aswani, for reminding us about that. Caesar says, it would be interesting to share information and tools that have been used by different participants to improve land tenure in their experience. Yes, please do that. We welcome you guys on the discussion forum. Share documents, share your experiences. People are reading the discussion forums. I'm reading it pretty much every day. I'm learning from you, and I know that the other participants can learn from you as well. So absolutely, please share tools or materials or reports that you have. We'd love to see those. Enterprise in land administration and governance for Indigenous communities. Is there a general view within the land sector as to how for-profit enterprise can play a role in securing land rights, particularly for Indigenous communities whilst, oh, I love when people use whilst. Americans don't use that, thank you. Whilst protecting and preserving basic security, privacy, etc. of individuals within these communities? Yes. I do think that there's a role for for-profit enterprises, and this may be a little controversial, and this is my own personal opinion. I do think there's a role for for-profit enterprises in land administration and land governance. And let me give you maybe an example. I think that given how technologies have developed over the last 5 to 10 years, it could theoretically be feasible for people to develop small businesses or larger businesses that use mobile technologies, that use drones, unmanned aerial vehicles, to voluntarily collect information about parcel borders, parcel holders, landowners, collect that information into databases, and then assist landowners to go through what is sometimes a very cumbersome process of registering for formal rights to land if landholders wish to do that. So if there is a regulatory and a legal environment that allows private surveyors, private entrepreneurs to create businesses to provide these services, I think that could be useful in some countries, especially because we started off by saying one of the main challenges in this sector is that there aren't enough financial resources, and there isn't enough human capital in the hands of government to secure the rights of landholders. So if it's feasible for entrepreneurs to provide services on a voluntary basis that people are willing to pay for, that allow them to secure their rights over resources, I do think that could be helpful in some countries. And I know that the concern would be some people would be able to pay for these resources and other people would not be able to pay for the resources. And for sure, that would be true. Just like in any market, certain people can afford luxury goods and other people cannot afford luxury goods. But at least having more service provision rather than less service provision, I would think would be a helpful thing in some countries. So this is one of those areas where there should be some very interesting entrepreneurial activity going on. You know, from the US, we're watching how blockchain technology might be used in the land sector. I could imagine franchise approaches to providing land sector service. Lots of different things, lots of different technologies now could be used to address some of these problems and could be used for Indigenous communities specifically. There's no reason why it would necessarily be different for Indigenous communities. I mean, I could easily see Indigenous communities themselves developing businesses to do this for other Indigenous communities. So Kartik, thank you very much. I appreciate that question. Okay. Let's see. So now it's 9:45. We have 15 minutes left. I'm looking at my great colleagues and they're saying yes. So I'm going to take just a few more questions. If we don't answer your questions, because there are a bunch of them, what we'll do is we will address these in a follow-up email to you or in a follow-up posting on the discussion forum. So you can keep sending your questions. It just gives me more stuff to answer, which is good. So Jim David Enion says, related to the question about setting up a cadastre, how could you enable access to a cadastre in very remote areas with high rates of illiteracy? If you're formalizing customary land rights in some ways, these customary rights are often related to remote areas. Okay, yeah, Jim, Thank you. Good. Another good question. So one way to think about setting up a cadaster is, or one process that you could use to capture information in a cadaster would be to first go through a participatory mapping process, which can be done with illiterate populations by drawing on a map the assets that they hold and talking with them to identify and validate who are the holders of those assets. And so have, let's say, a remote access to a regional or a national cadaster in every village. If you were able to go through a robust participatory mapping process and capture village level information, you could always leave the participatory map, should leave the participatory map in the village so that local people understand what rights are, where boundaries are, etc. Now the challenge here would be subsequent fragmentation and subsequent transfers of land. And so I could easily imagine having a visual document rather than a written document that would capture information about subsequent transfers. Sometimes, remember I said at the beginning, a lot of times we look to high-tech solutions to solve problems, but sometimes there are really effective low-tech solutions to solve problems. And so this isn't exactly the same thing, but let me give you an example from a place I love to work, which is Namibia. In Namibia, community conservancies back in the 1990s were given rights to manage wildlife. A lot of the people who were given this important right didn't necessarily have a whole lot of training in wildlife management, but they knew they had to keep track of wildlife over time. And so they created a very simple but very effective game management tracking system that involved sort of a simple census kind of noting using XXXXX, how many zebra are there? Well, you'd go out and actually count them and keep track of them in a book. It didn't have to be through a sophisticated aerial survey. It didn't have to be through using a sophisticated SQL database. It had to do with people making taking down the right kinds of information in a book that they held in their hands that they kept at their conservancy offices, the local conservancy offices. Somehow, of course, that information eventually needs to get to the cadaster, and that could be by the government coming around once a year to collect the information that's been captured in a book. Okay, so yes, those are real issues, but I think they can be addressed sometimes through some lower tech approaches. Nordir asks, regarding the role of individuals and tenure security, how can individuals support improvements in tenure security of land ownership? So let me see if I can get at the gist of your question. Individuals, and I hope this is gonna address what you mean, Nordir. Individuals can support securing different types of ownership by, number one, understanding what the different types are. In many countries, as we talked about, there's both a formal legal system and there's oftentimes a customary system. So understanding both of those systems, if it's possible to get access to information about the formal statutory land system, can help you as an individual help other people to secure their rights. A system may recognize a certain set of rights. A formal system may recognize different sets of rights. If you're only familiar with one or the other, you may not be able to do as good a job protecting your own rights, but also protecting the rights of others. So gathering information can help you perhaps to support improvements in tenure security in your community, among your family members, with your friends. I suppose other things that you can do would be bring your knowledge of technology to bear to solve some problems in your community. So if you have a smartphone, right, if you have this thing and you can identify an application like USAID has been developing over the last couple of years, if you can identify a mobile application that you can use to identify and map land boundaries, what a cool thing that would be for you. You could actually maybe help assist your community to demarcate and address some land issues within your community. So if you're if you're comfortable with technology, see what the tools are that are out there to help your community. And then maybe finally, recognizing that that it is important to engage with men and boys about women's land rights, maybe facilitate conversations that would allow people to feel comfortable discussing why recognizing and protecting women's land rights and inheritance rights of girls as well as boys is important for a community. No, dear, thank you so much for that question. Okay, I think I'm going to take one more question, and I'll try not to babble on too long. This is from Will Logan. Will, thank you. In regard to land formalization, Will writes, though well-meaning, I imagine governments in some developing countries may not have the ability or capacity to properly implement land formalization measures. Thus, I can't help but wonder if well-intentioned policies might lead to unintended consequences, such as land grabs by powerful investors or poor households losing control of their property. Are you familiar with any situations, outcomes like this? And if so, what are some good ways to avoid these instances? Okay, all right, and then there's another comment below. Yeah, absolutely. Well-intentioned formalization efforts can and have had unfortunate unintended consequences. So maybe the most well-known example of this, Will, is the Swinnerton Plan in Kenya, developed by the British colonial powers and designed to individualize and secure rights to property among Kenyan smallholders in the 1950s. You know, not just the Kikuyu, but other folks in rural Kenya. And the plan, well-intentioned, it was to provide security, but to do it in a way that did not align particularly well with either the custom or the historical context in Kenya, and eventually led to a situation where, just as you describe, powerful elites who understood how the formalizing system worked were able to use that system, their knowledge, their greater resources, their connections maybe in Nairobi, to acquire rights to land from poorer, less literate, less powerful individuals, and over time led to this sort of the situation in Kenya where there's quite a lot of land consolidated in the hands of a small number of relatively powerful families. So yes, it's always important when you're thinking about programming to take the time and think through what could the unintended consequences of what I'm suggesting be. How might this project or process inadvertently advantage some and disadvantage others? This is why I think we keep emphasizing throughout the course, it's so important to understand the local context. It's so important to understand the history of a place. It's so important to be respectful of customary systems because they evolved for a reason. People from other parts of the world might not always understand why they evolved, and we might not always understand, or we might not always agree with all the rules in a customary system, but they reflect decisions that have been made over the course of a long period of time by local people themselves to deal with local problems. And if you start messing with those systems, yeah, it can have some really unfortunate unintended consequences. So I see, I know I have another South African comment. I've got 5 minutes. Sandy's saying, stop, you can't keep talking. But I think I can fit in one more. So I'm going to take Jacques Dupre's comment from South Africa. South Africa's land system is definitely in for a rough ride. Numerous radical political parties calling for very radical land reforms and land grabs. This conflicts with our constitution, guaranteeing everyone safe land tenure and property rights. Ours is definitely a tenure dispensation where currently, especially in the ag sector, negative incentives reign. in particular ag disinvestment as a result of social and political calls and pressure for radical land reform. The disinvestment is also already hugely influencing our food security. Yeah, Jacques, it's a very challenging land tenure environment in South Africa. I've done a fair, not so much in the recent past, but I've done a fair amount of work in South Africa, and it's just an amazing country, and it has such a again, a really fraught history going back a long time, and certainly including the 1913 Native Lands Act. So how this process gets worked out is likely to be very disruptive, and will almost certainly have impacts on agricultural production. So again, I think it's critically important that the process be transparent and inclusive, and recognize rights of many, Thank you, Jacques. All right, now I really do have to stop because Sandy will yell at me if I don't. I see we have a lot of other, she wouldn't really yell at me. We have a lot of other questions and comments. So first thing I want to say is thank you so much for being engaged in the conversation with us today. It's such a pleasure for me to have an opportunity to chat with you. It's such a pleasure to read your comments in the discussion forum. I love reading what you have to say. I don't always have the time to do a long response to every comment, but please know that I'm reading your comments, and I'm appreciating so much you sharing your experiences with us. I want to encourage you to continue sharing your experiences. They're good. It's beneficial not only, and certainly not primarily for me, it's beneficial for your participants. And maybe I'll close by saying we are also so pleased that we have over 1,300 registrants for the MOOC this year. I'm so delighted to have people from literally all around the world taking part in this course from a wide variety of disciplines, bringing your knowledge, your experience, your interests, and your passions to bear to address this subject. In my final moments with you, I'll let you know, give you a heads up that we have a really exciting hangout coming up later this month. We're going to be interviewing one of the chieftains from a customary land area in Zambia. We're actually going to be interviewing a female chieftain, and she's going to be talking with us about her experiences securing and certifying the land rights of the people who live within her chieftaincy. So we'll be talking to her about what exactly she's done, what are the challenges she's faced, what does she hope is going to happen as a result of these efforts. And we would love to have you participate in that conversation. It will be coming from the World Bank's annual Conference on Land and Poverty, which is the great big conference that the World Bank holds every year, specifically devoted to the land issue. For those of you who might be joining us in Washington for the Land and Poverty Conference, I encourage you to please stop by USAID's booth. We'd love to meet you in person. I'd love to meet you in person. Hopefully I'll be at the booth enough to meet you. But we'd love to see you there, and we encourage you to join us for the next MOOC Hangout, which will be live from the World Bank later this month. So thank you all so much for your time today, and we'll look forward to seeing you and here in the future. Thanks.